On September 3, 1939, England declared war. At 13.30, the order of the German Naval Command was received immediately begin hostilities against England. On the same day, the commander of the Western Naval Group, Admiral Sulwechter, Fleet Commander Admiral Bohm, and I gathered for a meeting at the command post in the building of the radio station in Niende near Wilhelmshaven. The atmosphere of the conversation was tense. We understood what the war with England meant. We knew that the forces of this naval power is almost inexhaustible, and although at first they are deployed slowly, but the further they go, the more their superiority will make itself known with greater force. Particularly concerned about the seriousness of the situation was the commander of the fleet, Admiral Bohm. September 4th. British planes made their first air raid on the locks and ships in the harbour Wilhelmshaven. The planes went on a shave, with great pageantry, and perished without making any notable progress. Submarine officers watched the raid from a floating submarine base in Wilhelmshaven. The success of our anti-aircraft gunners set everyone optimistic. At the beginning of the war, our task was to make the best possible use of the small forces available to fight one of the most powerful maritime powers. Operationally, I reported directly to the headquarters of the leadership of the war at sea, which gave instructions guided by the general interests of the conduct of the war. During the initial period of the war, while the German submarines were operating in the North Sea, the right to instruct me was also vested in the commander of Naval Force Group West, who was responsible for the course of operations in the North Sea to the headquarters for the management of the war at sea. Assessment of the situation suggested that in the first period of the war, the enemy will have to send a significant part of the ships going to England, one by one, because the organization of the system of convoys required time. Ships of neutral countries bound for England were also to be sent singly. It was therefore thought probable that the British would attempt a general patrol over large portions of the North Sea and in areas west of England, endeavouring to carry it as far westward as possible. This task could be accomplished with the greatest effect by British aviation. Patrolling by light naval forces was less likely. The exception was the coastal areas and approaches to ports, especially at the nodes of maritime communications. It was taken into account that the defence of convoys, in all probability, would be carried out by destroyers and escort ships such as corvettes and armed fishing vessels, and, near the coast, also by aviation. The submarines were obliged to wage war according to the rules of prize law. These rules were in accordance with the terms of the 1936 London Protocol on the Rules of Submarine Warfare. As already stated, a submarine had to act like a conventional surface ship, first stop and search a merchant vessel, whether or not it was armed. If the conditions of the prize law allowed for the sinking of a ship because of its nationality or the nature of its cargo, the submarine had to first ensure the safety of the crew. It was considered that the lifeboats of the ship itself were not sufficient. According to the prize law, the following were not subject to compulsory inspection. 1. Merchant ships travelling in the protection of warships or covered by aviation. 2. Merchant ships engaged in hostilities or resisting inspection. 3. Troop transports, since they are acting in the interests of the enemy, belong to his armed forces and therefore may be considered as warships. The content of the combat orders that submarines received at the beginning of the war conformed to these conditions of prize law. The task was therefore to make the best possible use of the available submarines by assessing the situation and taking into account the limitations imposed by prize law. This could only be accomplished in the following forms: single vessel attack. For this purpose, submarines were deployed in selected operational areas west of Ireland and Great Britain. Since action against lone ships was authorized under prize law, the areas of engagement were not assigned near the coast but further west. Submarines were to operate out of range of enemy patrol aircraft whenever possible. In the North Sea, submarines were assigned combat missions also under prize law and operated mainly against neutral vessels, mostly Scandinavian. These vessels, proceeding either from Cape Skagen or from Bergen and crossing the North Sea, sought to reach the east coast of England. In the course of actions against single vessels, we came to the conclusion that the enemy was trying by all means to suppress the combat activity of our submarines against merchant shipping, although it was conducted within the framework of prize law. The following enemy activities were noted. Air patrols were carried out, not only over coastal areas, but also over areas of the Atlantic further west. The British Admiralty sent aircraft carriers to these areas to secure them from submarines. Carrier patrols put the submarines at a great disadvantage. They were allowed to operate against merchant ships only in a surface position. On September 17, 1939, the submarine U-39 seemed in sight of the aircraft carrier Arch Royale, which she attacked. The submarine fired 3 torpedoes with magnetic fuses at the enemy, but the fuses went off prematurely, and the torpedoes exploded before reaching the aircraft carrier. Thus, the command of the German Navy was deprived of the opportunity to achieve a major success. Not only that, the submarine was destroyed in the process. September 19, 1939, submarine U-29 attacked the aircraft carrier Courageuse, which was in its operational zone. She was lucky her torpedoes exploded in time and the aircraft carrier went down. After these 2 cases, the British Admiralty decided that to protect remote areas with the help of aircraft carriers a pleasure too expensive, and pulled from the Atlantic all aircraft carriers. This measure, of course, made it much easier for submarines to act against merchant shipping. Very soon submarine commanders began to report that the ships, having detected a submarine, give notice of it by radio. When a submarine was encountered, the SSS signal and the ship's coordinates were broadcast. As a rule, British airplanes or warships would then appear, forcing the submarine to go underwater and refuse to attack the merchant ship. The ships always broadcast the same unusual signal, which dispelled doubts that they were being broadcast on the basis of a compulsory order issued by the British Admiralty to include merchant ships in the warning system. This was contrary to the London Protocol on Submarine Activities, which excluded merchant ships from participation in hostilities. Soon the corresponding orders of the British Admiralty also fell into our hands. See, on September 6, 1939, one of the submarines for the first time was subjected to artillery fire from a merchant ship that discovered it. 2 weeks later, the British Information Bureau published as an example worthy of emulation a report that a merchant ship had fired on the submarine and driven it to flight. On September 26th, the First Lord of the Admiralty announced the arming of British merchant ships to combat submarines. This officially confirmed the initial arming of British merchant ships with artillery. On October 1, 1939, the British Admiralty called on the radio to ram German submarines. Neutral ships also attempted to do so. One such case was reported by a U-3 submarine operating in the North Sea. The radiogram reported the detention of the Swedish ship gun, the captain of the ship on board the submarine. Papers out of order. 36 tons of explosives supposedly for the Belgian War Ministry. However, the vessel was 15 miles south of Lindesnes, following a course of 280 degrees. While preparing the prize command, the vessel abruptly shifted rudder and, giving full sail, attempted to ram the submarine. The boat dodged the ram by only giving the diesel's maximum revolutions. The prize crew then sank the vessel. At night, all the ships went without lights, that is, as warships. And it was difficult for the submarine to determine who it detected, a merchant ship or a warship. It had to get close to the detected object to get a good look at it. If the vessel was ordered to stall using a searchlight, the return glimpses blinded the submarine and reduced its combat effectiveness, while the enemy got an accurate view of the submarine's location. If the delayed vessel had artillery or was a trap vessel, the submarine could be destroyed by surprise enemy artillery fire. To the enemy, measures that made action against merchant shipping under prize law more difficult were added restrictions from the German command. The reason for such restrictions was the sinking by the German submarine U-30 of the English passenger steamer Athenia, which occurred at the very beginning of the war, September 4, 1939. The ship without lights was zigzagging on an unusual course. The submarine commander decided that it was an auxiliary cruiser and let it go down. In the evening of the same day, the submarines received an order by order of the Führer to refrain from any hostile action against passenger ships, even if they follow in convoy. This order put passenger ships in an exceptional position, because when travelling in convoy their sinking was permitted by international law. An exception was made for French ships. On September 3, 1939, the submarines received the order. France considers itself to be at war with Germany from 15.00. Use weapons only in self-defense, even when acting against merchant ships. On September 6, 1939, the submarines were given a new order confirming the first order. The situation with respect to France is still unclear. German submarines to use weapons only for self-defense, even when acting against enemy merchant ships. Identified French vessels are not to be detained. Avoid incidents with France at all times. According to this order, French ships were treated even better than any neutral vessel. Under prize law, a neutral vessel could be detained, inspected, and, if found to be unauthorized chartering, confiscated or even sunk. Under the order of September 6, 1939, however, the submarine commander was obliged to try to establish that the vessel he was about to detain was not French, since he had no right to detain a French vessel. This was very difficult and often simply impossible. At night and in fog, such actions were excluded altogether. All these orders imposed on submarine commanders excessively large duties to classify and identify ships before each attack and very heavy responsibility. In addition, because of them, the submarine was often exposed to great danger, since in identifying a vessel, it was forced to stay at periscope depth longer than was desirable and risk being detected. As the submarine was charged with the duty of ascertaining the nationality of vessels, it often had to delay its attack at night, being dangerously close to the enemy, although rapid changes of situation required immediate action and the seizing of a favorable moment. The prohibition against French vessels was not lifted until late September. On all these measures, the headquarters of the management of the war at sea responded with extreme caution, although they violated the very basis of the London Agreement on the rules of submarine warfare. By a series of orders, the orders restricting submarine warfare were gradually abolished. It began with authorization to use weapons against vessels that used radio communication when encountering a submarine, were proceeding without lights, or were armed. Then came the authorization to attack any identified enemy vessel, and the orders ended with the declaration of areas of combat operations, which included at first only partially, and since August 17, 1940, all the waters around the British Isles. in the areas of hostilities allowed to attack ships without warning. It should be emphasized that the German Naval Command from the very beginning scrupulously adhered to the international legal provisions of the London Protocol, and non-compliance with them on our part began to occur only after these provisions were violated by the enemy himself. Making all these changes and issuing the corresponding orders to submarines, which regulated combat operations against merchant ships, was within the competence of the Headquarters for the Management of the War at Sea, acting in contact with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the state leadership. Compared with American and British orders concerning submarine warfare, the form in which they were given in Germany was politically very restrained. Thus, in early April 1940, British submarines operating in the Skagerrak Strait were ordered to sink German ships without warning during the day and all ships at night. This order went much further than the German orders, and the British submarines sank here even neutral merchant ships travelling at night with all lights. Similarly, the US, simultaneously with the declaration of war on Japan on December 7, 1941, declared the entire Pacific Ocean a war zone and began unrestricted submarine warfare. It is obvious that the US went farther in its measures than the Germans and was politically much more unconcerned. As commander of the submarine forces, I periodically received orders from the headquarters of the leadership of the war at sea in what forms, based on the political situation, should be conducted underwater warfare. Gradually, these orders freed me from the restrictions of the London Protocol, which was entirely in accordance with my wishes and reports, because the London Protocol regulations, due to non-compliance by enemy vessels, put submarines in a very dangerous position. Of course, it was necessary to fulfill all the orders of the headquarters of the Management of the War at Sea. Nevertheless, the Nuremberg Tribunal placed all responsibility for the conduct of submarine warfare on the commander of the submarine forces. However, taking into account the fact that in England, even in peacetime, instructions were issued for merchant ships which deprived them of the status of merchant ships, as well as the issuance during the war in the United States and England of instructions on the conduct of submarine warfare, the Nuremberg Tribunal condemned me not at all on the charges brought against the submarine warfare carried out by Germany. As a result of actions against merchant shipping German submarines under prize law, and a number of orders for the period from September 3, 1939 to February 28, 1940 were sunk 199 ships with a displacement of 701,985 reg.br. Unrestricted action against convoys. Peacetime experience suggested that action against convoys would be effective. Therefore, in the first months of the war, attempts were repeatedly made to organize groups of several submarines and apply the tactics of attacking convoys, which had been worked out in exercises. As early as August 19, 1939, on the submarines going out to sea thoughtfully planted the commanders of the 2nd and 6th flotillas. When attacking convoys, they were to help me manage the packs. In the real situation, the case was as follows. In the first half of October were to enter into service 9 submarines. An opportunity seemed to present itself which had been eagerly awaited since the beginning of the war. On October 1, 1939, I made the following entry in the combat log of the commander of the submarine force. The situation is characterized by the fact that we have an insignificant number of submarines. The enemy is pulling merchant ships in convoys, so it cannot be considered advisable to disperse the boats over a large area. The task is to intercept convoys and destroy them, acting in groups of submarines. Searching for convoys on the high seas is difficult. Submarines should be put into action in areas where communications are naturally tied up. Such conditions exist southwest of England and in the Straits of Gibraltar. British battle positions are favourable in that the routes of approach to them are short. Sea areas near the coast are intensively patrolled due to the presence of a large number of coastal bases. At this time of year, unfavourable meteorological conditions can be expected here. Gibraltar is disadvantageous because the routes of approach to it are longer. But since the paths taken by submarines here are crossed by trade communications, we can expect successful actions in this area. Gibraltar has the advantage of greater density of communications. The meteorological situation here is expected to be more favourable than in the north. About patrolling, which here can be carried out only from Gibraltar and Casablanca, according to the few reports available, it is known that it is maintained only in the strait itself. I have decided to send submarines to act on the communications passing through Gibraltar. Plan. Success would depend on the concentration and surprise of the submarines' attack. They coming into service at different times, so they will leave the bases on different days and first occupy the area southwest of Ireland, which in terms of the number of ships sunk so far considered the best. When all the submarines have assembled in this area, the commander of the submarine force will give the order to proceed, and depending on the situation he may give it a little earlier or a little later. The commander of the group operating in the Atlantic will be on board U-37. If it seems to him that the situation in the Strait of Gibraltar does not promise great success, he can deploy submarines along the Spanish and Portuguese coasts, a little farther from the enemy bases, although such an arrangement of boats crosses only communications, going in the meridional direction. In practice, however, it turned out differently. 6 submarines dropped out due to special assignments, delays in shipyards, and due to losses. In the joint action against the convoys, which began on October 17th, participated only 3 submarines, which sank 3 or 4 ships. A shortage of torpedoes prevented greater success. One of the boats, having used up all the torpedoes, had to return to base, and the remaining 2 boats lost contact with the convoy, which was under air cover. Similar attempts were made in the second half of October and early November, and each time there were not enough submarines to intercept and jointly attack convoys on the high seas. All this said that required a reserve, at the expense of which could strengthen the strike in the direction of the main blow. Therefore, it was decided to send submarines in the Atlantic only one by one, and as soon as they were ready to go. Only in the summer of 1940 it was possible to begin joint actions. This time they led to significant successes. Thus, in October 1940, for 2 days of joint action was sunk 38 ships from the 3 convoys. Anyway, the successes achieved in early October 1939. Despite the small number of submarines in the group that attacked the convoy west of Gibraltar, proved that submarines are capable of fighting the convoy. In addition, concluded that from the submarine cannot be realized reliable tactical leadership of the attack of the convoy. But it was not required. If the connection commander left the area patrolled by enemy aircraft to control the submarines of the connection, being in a surface position, the convoy was out of range of visibility, and the connection commander could not assess the situation in the area of the convoy. If the commander remained close to the convoy, the submarine from which he controlled the formation was in the same conditions as the others, exposed to the forces and means of anti-submarine defense. In addition, with a shortage of submarines, one could not afford the luxury of diverting one of the boats from combat operations to perform a special task as a submarine of the formation commander, unless it was really necessary for the success of the attack. In addition, the compound commander was essential in the rear after all. It was necessary to train new crews and prepare submarines entering service. A number of factors argued against the management of formations from a submarine. At the same time, experience showed that being on shore, you can successfully control submarines attacking the convoy. Control of the submarines consisted mainly of reporting to the commanders the situation as I knew it from various sources of information, comparing the reports of the submarine commanders, and making corrections if there were ambiguities and contradictions in those reports. Directing individual boats or groups of boats to the enemy, assigning boats to maintain contact with the enemy, and replacing them if they lost contact. Thus, the control of boats from the commander of the connection was realized only up to the moment of the attack and ceased with its beginning, when each submarine commander began to act independently. The success or failure of the operation depended on his skill, initiative, and persistence. The commander bore the brunt of the battle, so victory was considered the conquest of the commander and the submarine crew. That is why the training of the submarine commander, the main attention was paid to develop his independence and initiative. Knowledge of the theatre of war and the ability to live in the situation, which was somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, on my part, exceeded all expectations. After each operation, submarine commanders made me personally detailed reports. These reports, separate reports on special matters, which were submitted to the appropriate officers of the headquarters of the commander of the submarine forces, and entries in the logs of combat operations allowed me throughout the war to reconstruct the overall picture of the situation at sea. When the operation began, the headquarters of the submarine force commander, on the basis of reports and radiograms of submarines approaching the convoy, quickly assessed the situation in the area of the enemy convoy. The introduction of special conditional signals used by submarines approaching the convoy to transmit reports was very useful, because due to the brevity of the signals, the enemy either could not quite locate the submarine transmitting them, or could not locate them accurately. If the situation did not seem clear enough, the command post radioed the submarine commanders to ask for clarification of data, and in half an hour received an answer. When it was necessary to make very important decisions that required detailed knowledge of certain elements of the situation, one of the submarine commanders was assigned a special time for radio-telephone communication, during which the commander personally, using the code, negotiated with the submarine commander. This allowed to receive comprehensive data necessary for making a decision, but this type of communication was used only in exceptional cases. As a rule, the officers of the operational department of the submarine forces headquarters and specially appointed officers for operations against convoys were submarine commanders who had sufficient combat experience and participated in attacks on convoys. It should be noted that the Chief of Staff of the submarine forces was characterized by sobriety of judgment, a feature very important for the correct assessment of the situation. These measures were to create a unity of spirit and thought between the commander, who was on shore, and submarine commanders who acted against convoys at sea. It must be said that during the war, everyone very much appreciated such an exchange of thoughts and views between the operating forces and headquarters. Laying mines by submarines. Because of the small number of submarines and orders that limited their combat activity, I very low estimate at the beginning of the war our chances of success in the fight against merchant shipping. Therefore, efforts were made to damage the enemy, if possible, in his territorial waters, that is, within the 3-mile strip adjacent to the coast. The fighting was to be conducted on the approaches to ports and at communication nodes. For this purpose, there were 2 types of bottom mines TMB with a 400 to 500 kg war charge, suitable for placement at depths of 25 to 30 meters, and TMC with a war charge of 100 kg, suitable for depths up to 35 meters. The fuse of these mines was triggered by the magnetic field of the ship at the moment when it passed over the mine. Both types of mines were characterized by successful design. International law allowed mines to be laid in territorial waters without prior warning. In addition, when fighting near the coast of the enemy increased opportunities for the use of torpedo weapons on its warships. Setting mines by submarines near ports and at the nodes of sea communications near the coast, that is, at shallow depths, in conditions of strong tidal currents and close proximity to the enemy, requires great skill and coolness from submarine commanders. And for these actions they deserve the highest praise. At first, the idea of climbing farther into the jaws of the enemy seemed too bold. Submarine commanders thought that my orders, prepared in peacetime in case of mobilization, hardly feasible. However, almost all the planned mine laying was carried out. Anti-submarine defense of the enemy in the first months of the war was still in the stage of organization. There were 34 such staging. With the exception of submarines U-33 and U-16, sunk respectively in the Gulf of Firth of Clyde and in front of Dover, all other boats completed the task and returned to base without damage. Putting mines in the North Sea was carried out by small 250-ton submarines, which because of their small size were as if specially designed for crawling in the holes. Until March 1, 1940, German submarines placed mines in the following locations. On the west coast of Great Britain, Loch Ewe Bay, Firth of Clyde, Liverpool, Swansea, Bristol Bay, Cape North Foreland. On the English coast of the Channel, Falmouth, Portland, Weymouth, Portsmouth, Dover. On the east coast of Great Britain, Invergordon, Dundee, Firth of Forth Bay, Blyth, Newcastle, Hartlepool, Inner Dowsing Bank, Newark Bank, Crossside Shoal, Lowestoft, Cape Orfordness, Cape Dungeness, Cromarty, Great Yarmouth, Houghton, North Hinderbank, Cape Flamborough Head. As to the successes we achieved by minesweeping, from radiograms intercepted following the laying of mines, we formed the opinion during the war that they were effective. For example, several areas near Liverpool were declared dangerous for navigation by the British Admiralty. And these data were received only a few hours after the U-30 conducted in these areas very successful mine laying in shallow water. From the message of the Admiralty was seen that the mines blew up several enemy ships. In the end, the British had to temporarily close Liverpool, the largest and most important port on the west coast of England, designed to receive imported goods. By other means, the British apparently had no hope of avoiding further ship losses. Radiograms intercepted from sinking and damaged ships showed that the barrages placed in front of other ports and at communication hubs were also effective. According to British data, during the Second World War on the German mine barrages lost 115 ships with a total tonnage of 394,533 reg.-br. In these successes is the share of German destroyer squadrons, which in the winter of 1939/40 made night sorties to lay mines off the English coast. Describing the hostilities, which were conducted directly off the enemy coast, it is impossible not to mention the operations aimed mainly against enemy warships. These include, first of all, the breakthrough of U-47 in the harbour of Scapa Flow. This operation deserves more detailed consideration because of the special circumstances of its planning and execution. From the very beginning of the war, I repeatedly returned to the idea of organizing a submarine breakthrough in Scapa Flow. I was, however, held back by memories of the failure that befell two similar operations during the First World War, as well as the great technical and navigational difficulties of the breakthrough, due primarily to the extremely strong currents in the area of Scapa Flow. For example, in the Strait Pentland Firth current speed reaches 10 knots, and since the maximum speed of a submarine in an underwater position, and even then only for a short time, was only 7 knots. This meant that it could be at the mercy of the current. Needless to say, the approaches to this most important base of the English fleet were covered by nets, mine barriers, booms and submerged vessels, and guarded by patrol ships. The English Admiralty, skilled in such matters, and the commander of the metropolis-based English fleet had no doubt that these measures were effective, and that the English ships in Scapa Flow harbour were perfectly safe. This operation seemed the most desperate of all operations involving a breakthrough into the enemy's base. I remember sitting in headquarters at a map of Scapa Flow harbour and puzzling over this problem for the umpteenth time. Suddenly my gaze stopped on the staff officer. With a certainty that left no room for doubt, he said, "I still think we can find a way to get in there." These words were the final impetus which induced me to take a serious interest in Scapa Flow Bay. The decision was to depend on the result of my research. Even in the early days of the war, I requested materials on Scapa Flow which were prepared by the headquarters of the management of the war at sea on the basis of available information. These indicated the location of proposed barrages on the approaches to the bay. On September 11, 1939, an aerial photograph was received from the Second Air Fleet showing ships in Scapa Flow Bay, in the area north of Flotta Island and in the strait between Ceuta and Rice Islands. Very valuable data on currents, lighthouses, and base defences were also contained in the report of the commander of U-16, who, on a mission, visited the Orkney Islands. He believed, for example, that it would be possible to penetrate Scapa Flow Bay through Hawke's Strait if the boom was inadvertently opened. We requested from the Second Air Fleet as accurate as possible aerial photographs of individual barriers on the approaches to the bay. On September 26 they were received by us and turned out to be of excellent quality. Deciphering the aerial photographs allowed us to make the following conclusions. A breakthrough through Hawke's Strait is hardly possible, and through Ceuta Strait and Cleestrain Sound unpromising due to the obstacles found there. B. Holmes Strait was blocked only by 2 apparently submerged vessels lying across the fairway in Kirk Strait and 1 vessel lying off the northern shore. To the south of this vessel stretched as far as Lamb Hill, a free passage 17 metres wide. Its depth gradually decreased from 7 metres, passing into a shoal. To the north of the submerged vessels there was also a small passage. Both shores of the strait were almost uninhabited. From my point of view, a night passage in this place at high tide is possible. The main difficulty lay in the field of navigation. In the end, it was decided to attempt a breakthrough. My choice fell on the commander of U-47. Having carefully studied the operational data and soberly assessed them, Prin took up the task. I informed only the Commander-in-Chief of Naval Forces about the planned operation, but even to him only a verbal report was made, because of which I had to go to Berlin. For the successful realization of the plan was necessary to observe the greatest secrecy. The most favorable for the operation was apparently the night of October 13th to 14. Both tides fell on the dark time, and there was a new moon. The submarine Prine left Kiel on October 8th. On my instructions, only G7E torpedoes were loaded on her. Mines were not taken, because it was to strike at targets, the probability of meeting with which was not in doubt. October 14th at 11:00 a.m. received a report from the British about the sinking of the battleship Royal Oak. It was assumed that this was the result of a submarine attack, and on October 17th, Prine's boat returned to Wilhelmshaven. He reported his actions as follows. Breakthrough into the bay and withdrawal, although associated with known difficulties, was possible through the Strait of Hill. There is very little space near the submerged ships. The strongest currents when leaving the boat went against the current, which had a speed of 10 knots. In the straight home sentries were not. Of the whole fleet, only the Rifles and Royal Oak were on the roadstead of Scapa Flow. First run hit the bow of the Rifles. Loaded 2 more torpedoes, second run, in the Royal Oak 3 hits. A few seconds later, the ship went up in flames. The boat immediately began to withdraw. After leaving the Strait of Hill, an intensive search was observed. From the area of Scapa Flow were heard explosions of depth bombs. A strong aurora borealis was rising to the zenith, and its light was much obstructed. It was clear that after this failure, England would thoroughly investigate and completely close all gaps that could be used for a breakthrough. At this time, Scapa Flow would be cleared, and the Metropolitan Fleet moved to another base. According to my assumptions, Loch Ewe, Firth of Forth and Firth of Clyde Bays were suitable for this purpose. New submarine operations were organised against the ships stationed here. This time the submarines took with them mainly mines, as it could not be counted on that at the moment of submarine breakthrough here will necessarily be British ships. The battleship Nelson was severely damaged when it ran into mines placed at the entrance to the Bay Loch Ewe submarine U-31. Immediately after laying a mine barrage in Firth of Forth Bay, the submarine U-21 received a report that the cruiser Belfast had hit a mine and was damaged. The operation in Firth of Clyde Bay ended, deeply regrettably, with the loss of U-33. Roskill's book War at Sea covers these events as follows. There was, of course, some doubt as to the route Prynne had actually taken to penetrate Scapa Flow. One thing was certain. All entrances to the raid must be closed as soon as possible. How ironic. The vessel intended to be sunk in the passage used by U-47 arrived in Scapa Flow the afternoon after the sinking of the liner Royal Oak. Following the sinking of Royal Oak, the First Lord of the Admiralty told the Cabinet on October 18th that he considered Scapa Flow unsuitable for basing the Metropolitan Fleet at this time. After much debate, it was decided to use Loch Ewe Bay as a temporary base, and in the meantime to improve the defence of Scapa Flow. However, the enemy anticipated the possible relocation of the fleet, and since the Bay Loch Ewe was defended even worse than Scapa Flow, it can hardly be considered a surprise that the battleship Nelson, on the 4th of December, was severely damaged, hitting one of the mines that were placed in the Fairway submarine 5 weeks earlier. On November 21st, in the Bay of Firth of Forth mine explosion damaged the keel of the new cruiser Belfast. This incident confirmed the full validity of fears that the enemy could place mines in the straits leading to Rosyth Bay. Before January 4th, 5 more of the 18 mines placed by the enemy exploded. Only then there was confidence in sufficient safety for the passage of the damaged battleship Nelson to Portsmouth for repairs. These events were carefully concealed from the enemy. The complications, however, were extremely serious, for there was no doubt that all our principal ports and bases would have to be closed for weeks until a means could be found to counteract the magnetic mines. From these excerpts it can be seen what a dire situation England and her bases were placed in by the laying of mines by submarines. Deploying the fight against the enemy's warships, we were deciding where the English fleet could be, after the base of Scapa Flow is unsuitable for parking. On this occasion, on October 18th, I made the following entry in the battle log. I believe that after the operation of U-47 at Scapa Flow, it seems most probable that the Metropolitan Fleet formations will be met in the area west of the Orkney Islands. The submarines U-56 and U-59 were sent to this area. On October 30th, 1939, a report from U-56 was received. 10.00. Rodney Nelson Hood 10 destroyer squadrons. Square 3492, heading 240 degrees, launched 3 torpedoes. Failures. The submarine heard those 3 torpedoes hit the side of the Nelson. The fuses did not work. The submarine commander, who with great exertion carried out the torpedo attack while in the midst of enemy destroyers, was so shocked by this failure that I decided to recall him from the active fleet and use him in the rear to train submarine crews. We later learned that at the time of the attack on the Nelson was Churchill. In the days of the Nuremberg trials, I came across a newspaper article that confirmed this fact. In military terms, the failure of the submarine U-56 was a major setback. However, the very idea of sending 2 submarines to the area west of the Orkney Islands was correct. With regard to the first period of the war until March 1st, 1940, the following should be noted in conclusion. The morale of the submarine crews was high. The crews were convinced that the submarine force would play an important role in the war at sea. All 3 submarine subclasses justified the expectations placed on them. The VII series submarine, which was fairly heavily armed and easy to control, had a range far exceeding the most cautious peacetime estimates. Recall that in 1942, the fighting off the American coast was conducted with the help of these submarines, based in French ports in the Bay of Biscay, and without additional reception of fuel at sea. Giving a positive assessment of the combat qualities of submarines, it is necessary to make 2 comments. In part of the submarine's engine foundations were too weak and could not withstand prolonged loads during long passages. When it became necessary to replace them, the boats had to go to ship repair plants for a long time, and all this time were not used for combat purposes. Another remark refers to the valves that closed the exhaust pipes of both diesel engines when submerged. Their design was unsuccessful. As the boat dived to greater depths, the valves leaked more and more, and the water, gradually accumulating, could create a serious danger, especially if the boat was pursued by the enemy for a long time. It is possible that in the first period of the war, our submarines died because of this. The accumulation of water in the boat forced it to blow ballast and surface in full view of enemy ships, which destroyed it. There was an obvious need to conduct training dives of submarines to great depths even in peacetime, as in battle such dives were obviously to be commonplace. Even in peacetime, the submarine crews should have practiced diving techniques and practically tested the submarines. As commander of the Vedigen flotilla, I conducted deep diving exercises with my submarines in 1936. During the exercise, all the boats, with the exception of U-12, were successful. The latter was almost lost due to a leak caused by a defect in the material part. Following this, the General Command of the Navy issued an order that prohibited henceforth diving to a depth of more than 50 meters. This decision was wrong, but requests to reverse it were unsuccessful. Everything must be tried in peacetime. In combat, learning is too expensive. But as already mentioned, during the war, our submarines in general well proven themselves. Worse was the case with torpedoes in service with submarines. Soon after the beginning of the war, it was revealed that the design of the magnetic fuse, which was supposed to be triggered when the torpedo passes under the bottom of the attacked ship, unsuccessful. Often the fuse was triggered either prematurely, that is, before the torpedo had time to approach the ship, or at the limit of its range, or it was not triggered at all, even under the ship. In addition, the torpedo went to a depth much greater than the specified depth. Cases of failure were noted even in the impact fuse. Technical experts at first could not identify the causes of failures, which did not stop since the beginning of the war. Submarine commanders received more and more instructions. On January 21, 1940, I described in sequence in the battle log all the events associated with the failure of torpedoes. For the victories we gained in actions against merchant ships and enemy warships during this period, we paid for the loss of 14 submarines. The damage was great, but for the command of the submarine forces, it was not unexpected. Such losses were anticipated in advance. In each individual case, if the opportunity presented itself, an investigation was made into the circumstances of the submarine loss that had been discovered or suspected. Such analysis is necessary for the continuous improvement of submarine control techniques and combat qualities. In general, the enemy's anti-submarine defenses turned out to be exactly as they were imagined in peacetime, neither weak nor strong. ASDIC was not as effective as was believed before the war in England. Otherwise, the submarines U-39, U-29, and U-56 would not have been able to go out in torpedo attack against the aircraft carriers Arch Royal Corridgeways and the battleship Nelson, surrounded by destroyer squadrons. Justifying the lack of submarine construction after the denunciation of the Anglo-German Maritime Agreement in April 1939, now sometimes refer to the allegedly made by me a few months after the outbreak of war entry in the Journal of Operations, that the anti-submarine defense of the enemy was not as effective as expected. There is a clear error here. Such a statement did not correspond to reality, and nothing of the kind was recorded in the Journal of Combat Operations. During this period, the enemy sank 14 submarines, which meant the loss of about 400 submariners. The total displacement of the lost boats was about 9,500 tons. During the same period, as a result of submarine actions, the enemy lost 199 ships with a total tonnage of 701,985 reg.-br. Tons 115 ships with a total tonnage of 394,533 reg.-br. Tons were lost on mines laid by submarines. Was sunk battleship Royal Oak displacement of 29,150 tons, aircraft carrier Courage's displacement of 22,450 tons. The battleships Nelson and Barham and the cruiser Belfast were damaged. This comparison shows the economy of submarine warfare, which allows for great successes with small forces and relatively low casualties. Know how to count, Nelson said of warfare at sea. His words in the first place can be attributed to submarines. With a relatively small number of submarines, the overall outcome of the action is quite large. In early March 1940, the number of submarines at sea was reduced to a minimum. And it was quite understandable, since before that, in February, the fighting involved a relatively large number of submarines. However, by mid-March, 8 submarines were to be ready for action in the Atlantic Ocean and 6 small submarines for action in the North Sea. In the Atlantic, planned group action against convoys, and in the North Sea, submarines were to attack ships travelling to England from the Baltic Sea and Scandinavia. For this purpose, submarines were assigned combat positions near the Norwegian coast, close to the exit points of these ships. Operational orders were soon prepared for submarines to operate in the Atlantic Ocean and for operations against merchant shipping in the North Sea. In the midst of the preparations, the Submarine Force Command received the following order from the headquarters for the direction of the war at sea. Delay submarines leaving bases. Submarines that left the bases, stop fighting off the Norwegian coast. Urgently put all naval forces on alert. Do not declare a state of special readiness. The next day I received in Berlin from the headquarters of Maritime War Management a clarification of the operational objectives underlying the order. The objective was to make a lightning landing in Norway and Denmark and occupy them. In Norway, it was planned to land in Narvik, Trondheim, Bergen, Egersund, Kristiansund, and Oslo. In the first 4 landing points, the troops were transferred exclusively by warships, in Kristiansund and Oslo by warships and transports. In addition, the landing of airborne troops in Stavanger, Kristiansund, and Oslo was envisaged. A number of signs indicated that the enemy was also planning military action against Norway. Therefore, it was decided to preempt the enemy. It was necessary to reckon with the fact that the enemy could begin action even before the German forces moved to implement the planned operation. The enemy is certain to actively oppose the landing of German paratroops. In this case, his actions will be directed against the ports occupied by us, or to create their own, that is, the British strongholds. It was also to be expected that the enemy will try with all his might to interrupt maritime communications between Norway and Germany, in accordance with the situation and plans to carry out a number of their own activities. Preparation was supposed to be completed by March 10th. However, it was necessary to take into account that the beginning of the operation could be delayed due to ice conditions. The main task of the submarine forces was to cover the own forces from the sea during the operation, when they approached the landing points. For this purpose, after the entry of our forces into the fjords planned for the landing, submarines were to immediately take deeply echeloned positions. Our main blow should be directed at Narvik. Due to the remoteness of the latter from the points of concentration of our forces and its economic importance for the export of iron ore to Germany, it was here that an enemy attack was to be expected. The further task of submarines was to act against British landings. However, because of the large number of points suitable for landing, it was not possible to cover the fjords with submarines. There was a danger that in such a case the forces might be concentrated where they were not needed, or, on the contrary, they might be insufficient where they were needed. It seemed advisable, therefore, that at first the submarine groups should form a reserve, taking up initial positions on the high seas close to the threatened areas. It was then possible to use submarines to strike at the enemy's rear and also to cut him off from bases when it became known where the enemy intended to land. The same groups of submarines could also be used to solve the third task to attack the enemy's naval forces if they try to interrupt maritime communications between Norway and Germany. If it is possible to inflict damage to the enemy on the approach, it will also contribute to the solution of the 3 tasks. Therefore, it made sense to position some of the submarines on the enemy's approach routes, as close to his bases as possible. To fulfill all these important tasks required a large number of submarines. Available in the line was not enough. Therefore, it was ordered to temporarily interrupt classes at the School of Submarine Navigation in the Baltic Sea and transfer its 6 small submarines to the fleet. At the same time, it was ordered to immediately put on alert 2 new submarines, U-64 and U-65, which were undergoing sea trials. These measures covered all submarines ready to go to sea. As a result, 12 ocean-going submarines, 13 small submarines and 6 training submarines could be used in the operation against Norway. Taking into account the factors outlined, the range of navigation, combat experience of the commander, as well as other combat qualities of each submarine, drafted an order that defined the tasks and composition of individual groups. 1 to provide landing points for the landing parties at Narvik in an echeloned manner, with 4 submarines at Trondheim, with 2 submarines at Bergen, with 5 submarines with the task of sealing the inner entrance, of which 4 boats are to provide both main entrances, and the 5th to take position in front of the harbour itself at Stavanger, with 2 submarines, of which one is to take position immediately in front of the harbour entrance, and the other in front of the outer entrance, at the same time providing geodescend. 2 to form 2 reserve groups to attack the enemy if he attempts to undertake counter-landing operations. A northern group of 6 medium submarines is to take up positions northeast of the Shetland Islands, and a southern group of 3 small submarines is to take up positions east of the Orkney Islands. 3. A group of 4 small submarines to take up positions east and west of Pentland Firth, where enemy warship traffic is possible. 4. A reserve group of 2 small submarines to take a position in front of Stavanger, and a reserve group of 3 small submarines to take a position west of Lindesnes in case the enemy tries to interrupt our communications. For this task, use training submarines with a short range. The distribution of submarines in groups is presented in the scheme. In the operational order, Dartmouth outlined all orders concerning submarines. The order was sent to the submarines in sealed bags, which were to be opened in the open sea on receipt of the conditional signal. About the upcoming operation knew a very limited circle of officers of the submarine force headquarters. None of the submarine commanders knew the purpose of the operation, for which the submarines were placed on alert. Such measures were necessary while the boats remained in German bases. Everything was done to keep the preparations for the operation secret. As for the prospects of the upcoming operation, I considered the situation in which the submarines were to operate quite favourable. True. In the fjords near the enemy's coast, they would mostly have to be in the underwater position, using only a few hours of the short northern night to charge their batteries. The navigational situation was difficult. Shallow depths favoured submarine detection. The calm sea surface in the fjords also facilitated their detection. The possibilities of tactical manoeuvring in these narrow areas were limited. However, along with the unfavourable factors, there were advantages. After all, and the enemy in manoeuvring will be bound by the narrow fairways of the fjords. He will have to pass in close proximity to the submarines, and he will remain undetected by them only under very unfavourable meteorological conditions. In general, to count on a particularly successful torpedo attacks could be counted on a deeply echeloned arrangement of a large number of submarines. All commanders and crews of submarines, including training and just past sea trials, already had some combat experience. Events developed as follows. Fearing the landing of the British landing, the headquarters of the Management of the War at Sea issued an order on March 11th, immediately begin to deploy submarine forces intended for action in the areas of Narvik and Trondheim. March 14th, on the basis of decrypted enemy radiograms, was established the presence of an unusually large number of British submarines in the North Sea. In the areas of Skagerrak, west of Jutland, and about Terschelling area 14 English submarines were detected. Since the operation was not to begin until March 20th, to destroy enemy submarines in these areas sent 8 small submarines, which, however, did not succeed. Only on April 10th, U-4 sank near Stavanger British submarine tile. March 20th, 1940, the German naval attaché in Oslo reported that in the area of Egersund detected presumably up to 6 to 10 British ships. Therefore, already out-to-sea submarines were ordered to change course and follow the Norwegian coast. However, the attaché's message contained unverified information. The small submarine U-21, which took part in the search for ships, ran aground in the area southeast of Mandal and was interned by the Norwegian authorities. Until then, no German submarine had run aground due to navigator error. Such cases were not observed in the future. This was particularly undesirable now that, in connection with the preparation of the landing operation, issued a special order to avoid any incidents off the coast of Norway. Fortunately, this incident did not have negative political consequences. On April 2nd, the headquarters of the leadership of the war at sea informed the command of the submarine forces of the date of the beginning of the operation, April 9th. The remaining submarines intended for participation in this operation went to sea. On April 6th, all the boats were ordered to open packages with the inscription Operational Order Dartmouth. I expected that by the morning of April 9th, all submarines will take the initial position specified in the order. On the morning of April 9th, according to the plan of the operation, began to receive reports of landing and occupation of ports provided by the plan. Submarines were then ordered to take, if they had not already taken, positions in the fjords. On the basis of intercepted and decrypted enemy radiograms the day before, that is, April 8th, we knew that there were a large number of enemy ships in the sea. At dawn on April 9th, line ships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, which were to cover the German destroyers west of the West Fjord, came into contact with a large group of the enemy. At 09:30 from the submarine U-56. Received a radiogram which said that she found in the area southwest of the peninsula Statland 2 line ships, which were heading south. Numerous air reconnaissance reports confirmed the submarine's report, and due to the situation, the order was given to redeploy the submarines to the area of enemy detection. At 18.15 U-49 detected a group of enemy ships travelling northward. At 12.00051 reported 5 enemy destroyers in the West Fjord, heading southwest. On April 10th, at 01.59 U-49 spotted 2 cruisers in the area west of Statland Peninsula. On April 10th, the Command of Submarine Forces received a report from the commander of the 4th Destroyer Flotilla that at dawn, taking advantage of poor visibility due to snow charges, the enemy destroyers broke into Ufute Fjord, with which he engaged in battle. There are casualties on both sides. This report allowed us to draw the following conclusion: submarines in positions in the West Fjord were unable to prevent the breakthrough of the British destroyers. The enemy's actions in the area of Narvik, as well as reports on the discovery of his ships in the area of Trondheim, gave reason to assume that the British as the main strike points chosen these 2 areas. The order followed to send 4 more submarines to Narvik and 2 to Trondheim. My order coincided with the corresponding instruction of the headquarters of the management of the war at sea, and submarines of the 5th group were sent to the designated areas. Since the transport ships intended to supply the troops operating in the area of Narvik did not arrive, the headquarters of the leadership of the war at sea ordered submarines U-26, U-29 and U-43, which were in the bases of Germany, to prepare for immediate departure to the area of Narvik. They immediately went there, having on board 40 to 50 tons of small arms and anti-aircraft ammunition, as well as other supplies for the troops. However, because of the difficult situation the enemy dominated the sea in the Narvik area, they had to be sent to Trondheim and unloaded there. Later, 3 more submarines went to Trondheim, each with 130 tons of aerial bombs and fuel for aircraft. The fuel tanks of the submarines had to be converted to transport gasoline. However, this method of fuel transportation was dangerous for submarines and was not used in the future. There was a case when, due to penetration of gasoline vapors inside the boat, 1 submarine almost died. In total, the submarines made 8 voyages to Norway with transportation purposes. On April 12th, the commander of U-38 reported the appearance in the area northwest of the West Fjord destroyer and 2 transports, heading northeast. Since there were no convoys of ordinary merchant ships in this area, it was assumed that the discovered transports were intended to support the landing operation prepared by the enemy. It was believed that the landing would take place in a fjord north of Narvik. On the same day, I received a decrypted radiogram about the departure from Scapa Flow British cruiser and 2 destroyers in the direction of Vogs Fjord. This radiogram confirmed the assumption of the enemy's intention to land an amphibious assault in the area north of Narvik, with the subsequent attack on it. Therefore, in view of the necessity of the presence of German submarines in Vogs Fjord, the submarines U-47, U-48, and U-49 from the 5th Group heading northeast were sent there. The submarines were to arrive at Vogs Fjord in time, that is, before the expected arrival of enemy transports. Radio reconnaissance data from April 12th indicated that the enemy intended to land in the areas of Namsos and Åndalsnes. Therefore, in addition to the 3 submarines sent to Vogs Fjord, the headquarters of the War Management at Sea ordered to send 1 boat to Namsen Fjord and 1 to Romsdals Fjord. 2 more small boats were then sent to Namsen Fjord. In the afternoon of April 13th, received a report of a new breakthrough in Ufjord Fjord in the direction of Narvik connection of British ships, consisting of 1 battleship and 9 destroyers. This report came not from the submarines, but from an officer who had a special assignment. So, submarines again failed not only to prevent the breakthrough of enemy ships, but even to report their approach. The headquarters of the management of the war at sea considered that the situation in the area of Narvik was very serious and instructed to send to the West Fjord all available large and medium boats. I suggested not to redeploy the boats, which were in positions in the areas of Trondheim, Namsen Fjord and Romsdals Fjord, considering that they would not be able to enter the West Fjord in time, while in the area of Trondheim they would be in place when the British landing forces landed. The headquarters was convinced of the correctness of my proposal the very next day, April 14th, when the landing of the English landing parties in the areas of Namsos and Åndalsnes had already begun. On April 16th, I sent another boat to Vogs Fjord U-65, as I still believed that this area will be the main direction of the British landing operation. On the same day, we received a report from the decryption service that a convoy had passed west of the Lofoten Islands heading north, presumably to Vogs Fjord. Now it was becoming increasingly obvious that the enemy had chosen this branched fjord as the area of the landing operation. However, it remained completely unclear in which part of the fjord will be landed. I believed that it would take place in the Strait Bugden, and ordered the boat U-47 to take a position there. The headquarters of the management of the war at sea considered as possible landing areas Lavangen and Gratangen, so after the approach of U-65 I assumed to send there for reconnaissance in U-47. On April 16th at 04.10 the commander of U-47 reported that in the Strait Bugden he found transports, which were at anchor. He fired 8 torpedoes at them, but without success. The lack of information about the results of submarine actions since the beginning of the Norwegian operation prompted me on April 11th. I requested from the submarines of the Group Narvik radio reports on the situation. It was necessary to find out the reasons for the failure of the boats, so we had to ignore the need to maintain radio silence in the area. We were even interested in the fact that the very fact of the presence of German submarines had a moral impact on the enemy. Reports received from the boats in the following days exceeded all expectations. April 11th. April 11th. April 10th in the evening attacked 2 destroyer squadrons with torpedoes. Did not observe the results of the explosion. U-25. At 12:30 p.m. Fired 3 torpedoes fanning the Cumberland mist. One of the torpedoes exploded at range. At 21.15, 3 torpedoes fanning the cruiser York, all torpedoes exploded before reaching the target. Depth of the torpedoes 7 meters. Zone 4. U-48. April 12th. April 10th, 22:50 hours. 2 misses. 1 torpedo exploded after passing the safety distance, and the other exploded 30 seconds after leaving the device, not reaching 100 meters to a large destroyer. U-51. April 15th. 14.04. Torpedoes fired at Warspite and 2 destroyer squadrons failed. U-48 launched 2 torpedoes at a transport. Unsuccessful. U-65. On April 16th, a report came in from U-47. The commander of U-47 reported as follows. April 15th. In the afternoon discovered enemy destroyers. Judging by the nature of their maneuvering, it can be assumed that the area is mined. In the evening found 3 large transports and 3 ships of smaller tonnage, following in the guard of 2 cruisers. Transports anchored near the southern part of Bugden. Transfer of troops to fishing motorboats going in the direction of Lavang and Gratangen. Transports and cruisers are standing in a cramped area, partially obscuring each other. 22.00. I go in an underwater position to the position of the salvo. Intention using 1 torpedo each, attack both cruisers and 2 transports. After that, reload torpedo tubes and go out to attack again. 22.42. Fired 4 torpedoes. The shortest distance of 750 meters, the longest 1,500 meters. Torpedoes were set at a depth of 4 and 5 meters. There was a wall of ships in front of the boat, not a single explosion. The enemy didn't notice anything. I'm reloading the torpedo tubes. After midnight, I repeat the attack from a surface position. Firing 4 torpedoes. The depth of the torpedoes is the same as in the first attack. To no avail. 1 torpedo deviated from the set course and exploded, hitting a rock. On departure, the boat touches the ground. Being in the vicinity of patrolling ships, with difficulty I break away from the ground. Beginning to pursue the boat and attack with depth bombs. Due to malfunctions in the engine room, I leave the area. April 19th. Detected Warspite and 2 destroyers. I attacked the battleship with 2 torpedoes from a distance of 900 meters. To no avail. Because of the detonation of a torpedo exploded at the limit of range, the boat is pursued by destroyers. April 18th. Land. 2 premature torpedo explosions in the area between Iceland and the Shetland Islands. U-37. April 19th. 2 torpedoes on Warspite. Range 900 meters, depth 8 meters, zone -4. 1 torpedo exploded prematurely, the other at range. U-47. On leaving Vogg's Fjord while firing on the cruiser Emerald, observed a premature explosion after 22 seconds. U-65. These radiograms were supplemented by verbal reports from the commanders after the submarines returned. In total, the picture was as follows. In 4 cases the boats attacked line ships, in 10 destroyer squadrons, and in another 10 transports, but only 1 transport was sunk. Torpedoes and previously caused a lot of trouble, but a sharp increase in the number of torpedo failures during the Norwegian operation was an unpleasant surprise for us. Of the number of torpedoes with magnetic fuses, fired April 11th boats U-25, U-48, and U-51, 6 to 8 exploded before reaching the target, which was 50 to 60% of the total number of failures. Of the torpedoes with a percussion fuse, fired on April 15th submarine U-47 on the anchored transports, none exploded. This dramatic increase in torpedo failures must have had its reasons. Immediately upon receipt of the first radiograms on April 11th, it was necessary to find out the causes of torpedo failures as quickly as possible, and by all possible means, and eliminate them. To find out the causes of this torpedo crisis, I gave during the Norwegian operation most of my time. On April 11th, the submarines fired torpedoes with magnetic fuses. Consequently, there were some special reasons for disabling the magnetic fuses in the northern zone of the Norwegian area. As early as November 1939, I reported to the Torpedo Weapons Inspectorate my doubts about the operation of magnetic fuses in the area. In due course, the reply was received: there is no reason to fear an increase in the tendency to premature triggering of magnetic fuses in the northern zone zono, and no magnetic influence should be taken into account, despite the ore deposits in the northern part of the Scandinavian peninsula. Exactly the same response was received on April 11th, following our report of premature triggering of magnetic fuses. The inspectorate recommended that we proceed as before, and that only when firing in a fan, torpedoes should be fired at 8-second intervals, and that either percussion fuses or magnetic fuses should be used. In this way, in the event of a premature detonation of a torpedo, the detonation of the other torpedoes by the explosion of a neighboring torpedo would be avoided. In addition, the Torpedo Weapons Inspectorate questioned whether torpedoes with magnetic fuses should be completely abandoned in favor of torpedoes with percussion fuses. It was noted that when attacking destroyers, which are known to have a shallow draft, torpedoes with percussion fuses due to the wrong course of the depth of up to 1.5 meters will pass under the keel of the enemy ship. It was decided to issue the following order. 1. In the Zone 0 and to the north of it, all submarines to keep ready to fire 3 torpedoes with the fuse set to shock action and 1 torpedo with the fuse set to magnetic action. 2. Firing at ships only torpedoes with the fuse set for shock action. Set the depth of torpedo travel to 2 meters less than the draft of the ship. 3. On destroyer squadrons to fire necessarily 2 torpedo salvo. The first to release a torpedo with a fuse set to shock action and a depth of travel of 3 meters, then a torpedo with a magnetic fuse with a depth of travel set to 1 meter more than the draft of the ship. The interval between shots is 8 seconds. So, when attacking ships, we had high hopes for torpedoes with a percussion fuse. We deliberately abandoned the more effective but less reliable magnetic fuse in favor of the more reliable percussion fuse. But even these hopes vanished on April 16th after receiving a report from U-47. She had failed to sink even anchored transports with a large draft with impact fused torpedoes. It was absolutely impossible to assume a miss when firing at these quietly standing and overlapping vessels. Apparently, either the torpedoes went much deeper than assumed by experts, or shock fuses did not have time to come to the firing position. So, our torpedoes did not work in the northern areas with neither magnetic nor percussion fuses. I asked on the phone Commander-in-Chief of Naval Forces for urgent assistance. Called to a meeting in Wilhelmshaven, Chief Inspector of Torpedo Weapons. In the course of the meeting it became clear as follows. 1. Some submarines had on board torpedoes with fuses of a new kind, which were not sufficiently tested before sending to the fleet. It was not excluded that the fuses of these torpedoes did not come to the combat position. 2. After negotiations with the Naval Observatory, we came to the conclusion that it was necessary to take into account the presence of magnetic anomalies in the Norwegian fjords, affecting the operation of magnetic fuses. 3. The Chief Inspector of Torpedo Weapons, not being sure of the correct depth course of torpedoes, expressed doubts about the expediency of using torpedoes with percussion fuses. As a result, the submarines received a new fusing selection order approved by the Torpedo Weapons Inspectorate. The G7E pattern torpedo passes below the prescribed depth of travel by more than 2 meters. B submarines operating in Zone 0 shall not use percussion fuses thereafter, but shall fire torpedoes with magnetic fuses, excluding areas inside narrow fjords. In fjords, the danger of premature magnetic fusing increases. C. When magnetic fuses are used, do not fire in a fan with a minimum time interval, but fire in salvos according to the rules of engagement. If the situation warrants firing in a fan, an 8-second interval between shots should be observed. When using torpedoes with magnetic fuses, the depth of torpedo travel should be set equal to the target draft for destroyers 4 meters, for submarines 3 or 4 meters. When using torpedoes with percussion fuses, the depth of travel should be equal to 4 meters, in good weather 3 meters. This instruction was based on the Torpedo Weapons Inspection's assumption that magnetic fuses would operate normally on the high seas, even in the northern zero zone, and fail only in fjords due to the effects of magnetic anomalies near the shore. This new order was extremely complicated, and I signed it only because there was no other option. It showed our helplessness, our inability to uncover the causes of torpedo failure, and exactly the same helplessness was shown by all the technical services responsible for the quality of torpedoes. These orders on the use of torpedoes, the choice of fuse, setting the depth of their course often contradicted each other and only complicated the actions of submarine commanders and torpedoists. The next day it became clear that the new order was based on false assumptions. As already mentioned, April 18th, the boat U-47 reported that in the Zone 0, even in the open sea between Iceland and the Shetland Islands, there were 2 premature explosions of torpedoes. Since the Chief Inspector of Torpedo Weapons informed me by telephone of the results of test firings, during which the torpedoes went at a depth exceeding the set depth by 2.7 meters, the final conversion to contact fuses became impossible. For all targets with a draft of less than 5 or 6 meters could not be hit. As it turned out later, torpedoes sometimes had even greater depth of travel. So, our submarines were actually left without weapons. Having received a report about unsuccessful torpedo attacks of U-47 against transports in Vogs Fjord, and the report of the Chief Inspector of Torpedo Weapons on April 19th about the results of tests conducted in Germany, during which the torpedoes still ran at a depth greater than the specified depth, I recalled the boats from Vogs Fjord and West Fjord, as well as from Namsen Fjord and Romsdals Fjord. They had nothing to attack the destroyer squadrons with. Torpedoes with a contact fuse passed under the ship. Torpedoes with a magnetic fuse triggered before reaching the target. Therefore, it became useless to use submarines in this area. This was the end of the actions of German submarines in the Norwegian operation. April 17th. Boats operating off the southern coast of Norway also received from the headquarters of the Management of the War at Sea ordered to return to the bases. On April 20th, U-47 met a convoy heading north in the area southwest of the West Fjord. Despite a favorable position for firing, the boat commander, having lost faith in torpedoes, refused to attack. The previous day he had to endure a fierce attack with depth bombs after a torpedo he had fired at the British line ship Warspite exploded at the limit of its range. On his return, he reported that he was not going to fight any more wars with these wooden bollocks. Such views were ingrained in the personnel of many submarines. People lost faith in torpedoes. After the Norwegian operation, I ordered an investigation into all the circumstances of the submarines that suffered such a serious failure. The inspection began with the command of the submarine forces, that is, with me. My task was to deploy the submarines so that they could always make attacks in the most critical areas. This task was not difficult, because we always easily learned about all the intentions of the enemy. Submarine attacks by liners, cruisers, destroyers, and transports testified that the positions of submarines, as a rule, chosen correctly. In the Norwegian fjord, submarines had a hard time. Narrows, short period of darkness, smooth water surface, constant proximity of powerful enemy anti-submarine defense forces, all this complicated their task. U-47 reported from Vågs Fjord an exceptionally strong and thoroughly prepared anti-submarine defense, similar to that which our boats encountered in British bases. This was to be expected, given the importance of the defended objects transports with British troops. And yet, despite such anti-submarine defences, German submarines in 36 cases went on the attack. Even a very picky analysis of these attacks found that, if the torpedoes were serviceable, we would have had hits in the following cases: from 4 shots on a line ship, 1 hit; from 12 shots on cruisers, 7 hits; from 10 shots on destroyers, 7 hits; from 5 shots on transports, 5 hits. What a great role the success of submarines could have played in the Norwegian operation. The landing was at great risk when in the Vågs Fjord, under the very nose of the German submarines, from the arriving transports from the British troops began to unload. If 8 torpedoes U-47 did not fail, all further actions of the British troops in the area of Narvik would look completely different. Losses of the German submarine fleet during the Norwegian operation amounted to 4 boats. After this operation, of course, there was a question about the expediency of further use of submarines armed with such poor quality torpedoes. The Chief of Operations of the Submarine Force Headquarters was strongly in favor of not using submarines in combat operations until the radical improvement of torpedo weapons. However, I realized that the cessation of submarine operations at this time will cause great damage to the entire submarine fleet. It was necessary to continue submarine warfare as long as there was even a slight chance of success. The energetic actions of Rear Admiral Comets, the newly appointed Chief Inspector of Torpedo Weapons, gave us hope that we would soon have at least 1 improved torpedo fuse. We also expected that we would soon achieve a correct torpedo depth travel. Therefore, I devoted the following weeks to visiting active flotillas and training establishments in the Baltic Sea. Conversations were held with the personnel of submarine formations. I managed to overcome the moral crisis, and the submariners began to go to sea with the hope of success. Soon no one doubted the correctness of the decision to continue the fight. The battle for Norway was illuminated in the light of my experiences, the experiences of the commander of the submarine forces. I did not participate in the development of the overall plan of combat operations. Now it must be said about the strategic necessity of this operation. From my point of view, the occupation of Norway was a necessary and therefore the right action, caused by the then military situation. All signs that England was about to invade Norway were there. It was difficult to judge the timing of the English offensive, but it was necessary to prevent it. It posed too great a danger to our military strategic position at sea and to our military industry. The point of view, which was that we should have waited, allowed the British into Norway, and then beat them out of there, contains so many dubious provisions and dangers that it could not be made a military concept. We knew that if England captured Norway, our country would lose the ore imported from the Scandinavian countries, that the English would threaten the Baltic Sea, and that the passage of our ships from the North Sea to the Atlantic would become much more difficult. At the time of preparation of the Norwegian operation, it was not yet known that through the capture of northern France we would soon achieve a significant improvement in our strategic and military economic position. At that time, the General Staff of the Army still believed that the war with France would require long and heavy fighting on the Maginot Line. I was in agreement with the Commander-in-Chief of Naval Forces, who in the winter of 1939/40 had pointed out the danger of an English invasion of Norway and considered it necessary to prevent this invasion. As torpedo failures were becoming more frequent, Navy Commander-in-Chief Raeder ordered on April 20th the establishment of a commission to investigate the causes of unsatisfactory torpedo performance. In addition to the already known causes of torpedo failure, the Commission found that most failures were due to very significant deficiencies in the design of the torpedo's firing mechanism. The firing pin was too short, and in addition, the primer fuse of the primary detonator burned too quickly. The Commission also found that the striker does not work at an angle of encounter between the torpedo and the target of less than 50 degrees. The striker was designed to operate at an encounter angle of 21 degrees, since in practice the encounter angle is often less than 50 degrees due to the streamlined hull contours, as well as due to the evasive maneuver of the ship from the torpedo. Taking into consideration the findings of this commission, the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy issued a document which read as follows. 1. In connection with the failure to fire torpedoes G7A and G7E during the Norwegian operation, I have ordered an investigation to determine the causes of the failure of the torpedoes and to determine the degree of culpability of those responsible for their manufacture. 2. The investigation revealed that the main causes of torpedo failure were the following deficiencies in their design and inspection before delivery to ships. A G7A and G7E torpedoes do not have depth accuracy in accordance with the combat torpedo formularies. B. The magnetic fuse has a number of technical defects. The percussion fuse does not meet the necessary requirements. C. In the torpedo department of the Kiel Naval Shipyard and at the torpedo range of the Experimental Institute of Torpedo Weapons, deficiencies were found in the preparation of torpedoes for delivery to ships. This item is under special investigation. In connection with the discovery of the deficiencies, the Commander-in-Chief of the Naval Forces ordered an investigation, which resulted in the conviction of some responsible employees of the military acceptance of torpedoes by a military tribunal. Although the work of the Commission to investigate the causes of torpedo failure and the investigation conducted by the court-martial brought greater clarity to the issue, the real reasons for the ineffective firing of our submarines during the Norwegian operation were not clarified until February 1942. On January 30th, 1942, the commander of the submarine U-94 operating in the Atlantic reported by radio that during a trial inspection of the torpedo, he found in the hydrostat pressure significantly higher than atmospheric pressure. The Chief Inspector of Torpedo Weapons immediately ordered the hydrostatic gauges of all torpedoes prepared for shipment to the active fleet to be checked. This revealed a large percentage of unsealed hydrostatic hulls. Violation of tightness was observed in the places of passage of steering rods through the glands into the hydrostat. For proper operation, the hydrostat must be hermetically sealed. Its operation is based on the principle of balancing the hydrostat spring pressure and hydrostatic pressure of the water column. In accordance with this, the depth of the torpedo stroke is set. Normal atmospheric pressure in the hydrostat is a prerequisite for the correct depth of torpedo travel. When increased pressure enters the hydrostat, excessive pressure is added to the force of the hydrostat spring and the equilibrium is disturbed. As a result, the torpedo goes below the specified depth, and the degree of its read depth cannot be foreseen. It is known that inside a submarine underwater, there is inevitably an increased pressure. It is the result of compressed air entering the solid hull. During a long underwater voyage, the pressure in the submarine increases greatly. This was the explanation of the reasons for the failure of torpedoes during the Norwegian operation. Submarines at that time were underwater for at least 20 hours every day. The pressure in the boats increased, it disturbed the leaky hydrostat and forced the torpedo to go below the set depth. This, apparently, was the reason for the failure of U-47 in the attack of anchored British transports. Moving at a depth greater than the set depth, the torpedoes passed under the transports and sank after passing their range. At one time, I ordered a thorough investigation of the reports of submarine commanders who took part in the Norwegian operation about torpedo failures. In the course of this investigation, inconclusive long-range salvos were generally attributed to inaccurate aiming, although there may have been instances of torpedo failure as well. Even though there were a limited number of controllable shots, there was a 33% net failure rate. The torpedo weapons inspection expert, who gave at the trial calculations which also took into account the number of shots that could be controlled, also arrived at a figure of 32.4%. However, now all these figures should be considered inaccurate, because at the time of the commission was not known such a significant cause of torpedo failure, such as leaky hydrostat, entailing a large read depth of torpedoes that cannot be corrected. In the Norwegian operation, therefore, too many torpedo shots were declared uncontrollable. Such shots were treated as misses and excluded from failure. Improvement of the torpedo and its development into an effective combat weapon took place during the war. In June 1940, it was finally decided to fire torpedoes only with a percussion fuse, because the unreliability of the magnetic fuse was proven. Thus, with regard to the explosive action of the torpedo, we returned to the level of 1918. To this was added the fact that, because of the undiscovered at that time causes of excessive deepening of the torpedo and related to this allegedly inexplicable misses, when firing at stationary enemy ships, submarine commanders sought to set torpedoes to the shallowest possible depth of travel. And since not every torpedo went to a depth greater than the set, then often the point of impact of the torpedo in the target was too high, which further reduced the fugitive effect of the explosion. So, the efficiency of torpedoes until December 1942, when the new magnetic fuse type P12 was introduced, did not exceed the efficiency that existed during the First World War. In the period between the two world wars, submariners urged to create such a torpedo that it alone could break the backbone of even a line ship. Torpedo weapon specialists assured that such a torpedo is quite realistic. However, until recently, the requirement of the fleet has not been fulfilled. To clarify the effectiveness of torpedoes, which we had to equip with shock fuses, was considered 816 hits in the period from January to June 1942. 40% of the ships were sunk by a single torpedo, 38% required 2 torpedo hits or more, and 22% of the ships got away with 1 to 4 hits. In 1940, operating against convoys in the Atlantic, and in 1942, operating in the Western Atlantic, individual submarines were often unable to take advantage of favorable conditions to attack merchant ships, since, because of defects in torpedo weapons, hitting the target was usually achieved at the cost of expending a large number of torpedoes. As a result, during the favorable period of submarine warfare, a large number of enemy ships were not sunk due to the lack of reliable magnetic fuses. In connection with the unsatisfactory performance of torpedoes, Revealed at the very beginning of the war, the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy ordered a change of command of the inspection of torpedo weapons, and December 21, 1939 appointed Rear Admiral Comets as Chief Inspector of Torpedo Weapons. Comet's unbiased approach to the incoming reports from ships about the malfunction of torpedoes and took measures to eliminate the causes of their unsatisfactory performance. The shortcomings of percussion fuses were eliminated. Since the end of 1942, after the improvement of the hydrostat, the torpedo's depth course became stable. Since December 1942, the ships began to receive the first samples of the new magnetic fuse, which could be used simultaneously as a percussion fuse. At the same time appeared maneuvering torpedo, which, having passed a certain distance, began a complex circulation, which increased the likelihood of hitting one of the ships of the convoy. In September 1943, the Navy received an acoustic torpedo, which was independently guided by the noise of the propellers of the enemy ship. As a result, torpedo weapons reached a high technical level, which, despite the development of technology in the post-war years, could not be surpassed by any fleet. When considering the shortcomings of torpedoes at the beginning of World War II, it is impossible to weaken their detrimental role by mentioning that in the US, Navy torpedoes had the same vices, or refer to the lack of means to test torpedoes at that time, or the insufficient number of experimental firing of combat torpedoes in peacetime. The point is not these explanations and excuses. Having sorted out the mistakes, it is possible to draw conclusions for the future. It is not difficult to establish whether the impact fuse works or not, and in peacetime by conducting test firings with a training combat charge compartment. It is not necessary to fire a live torpedo shot for this purpose. This also applies to the magnetic fuse. It is absolutely inexcusable that in the hope of a magnetic fuse, the Experimental Institute of Torpedo Weapons, having made in peacetime only two far from flawless experimental firings of torpedoes, with percussion fuses declared these torpedoes fit for combat use. For the operation of the magnetic fuse is essential to the magnitude of the distance of the torpedo from the magnetic force field of the ship. Therefore, it was necessary to achieve accurate torpedo travel in depth. The Experimental Institute of Torpedo Weapons did not pay sufficient attention to keeping the torpedo at the specified depth of travel. The technical solution of the hydrostat housing design, through which the steering rods passed, was also unsuccessful. Hydrostat did not have the proper tightness. In the percussion fuse, the striker igniting the primary detonator moved not in the natural direction of impact and turned by a system of levers by 180 degrees. At a sharp angle of meeting the torpedo with the target, the levers easily jammed and the fuse was not triggered. It was necessary to improve the design of the striker so that it moved straight forward to ignite the primary detonator. Changing the direction of the shock by 180 degrees was also technically unsuccessful. So, it came down to avoidable design flaws. Both of these flawed torpedo designs were adopted by the Navy between World Wars I and II. In World War I, there were no such defects in the torpedoes. The torpedoes were reliable. There was no shortage of money between the wars. This is evidenced by the creation of expensive improvements in artillery, such as fire control devices, stabilizing devices, and others. In short, there were serious lapses in the development, improvement, and testing of torpedoes. One of the reasons for this was that the Experimental Institute of Torpedo Weapons, being an institution of the Navy, was itself engaged in the improvement of torpedoes. It designed the torpedo, made test firings, and decided whether it was suitable for the Navy. I think this organization is wrong. The armed forces should order the weapons they need for warfare from private firms, not build them themselves. The best designs resulting from industrial competition should be thoroughly tested by the armed forces, under combat conditions if possible, and accepted only when they meet all requirements. The torpedo is an exception in this respect, for private industry cannot be trusted to conduct experimental firing of torpedoes on the high seas. However, neither should the improvement of the design, testing, and decision on the suitability of a torpedo for the fleet be concentrated in one hand. Another psychological factor that influenced the insufficiently complete torpedo tests in peacetime conditions was the uncritical approach of the Experimental Institute of Torpedo Weapons to its work. After all, during peacetime torpedo tests, there were already observed phenomena that the Institute should have reflected on. And in peacetime, many experienced sailors commented on the insufficient combat suitability of the torpedo. However, the designers continued to defend their point of view, assuring that torpedoes work without fail. I think it is wrong that the officer in charge of technical improvement and testing of torpedoes has only technical knowledge. Such an officer must have combat experience in the use of this or that weapon to be improved, know exactly what is required by the fleet in combat and technical terms, and clearly understand what requirements will be made to these weapons in the fleet. Good naval and tactical training and appropriate abilities are more important to him than special technical knowledge or specialized engineering training. These must be possessed by the designer who collaborates with this officer. Only then will we achieve the desired results. The occupation of command positions in technical centers by specialist officers with engineering knowledge may even be detrimental. Since one person rarely possesses both operational and technical gifts, the military side often suffers damage. This applies to the improvement of weapons, the construction of ships, and their armament. The naval officer engaged in technical improvement and design must possess, as the British aptly defined it, seaworthy qualities. Otherwise, the technical man will outweigh the naval man of war. Torpedo weapons were generally improved between the two world wars. The small air bubble formed when a torpedo is fired was eliminated. The traceless electric torpedo, the idea of which originated as early as 1918, came into service. Other attempts to improve torpedoes were unsuccessful, which was revealed at the beginning of the war. Because of the defects of torpedoes in service with submarines, during the Second World War was missed more than one major target. Because of premature explosions of torpedoes were detected and destroyed submarines U-39 and U-27. It is the seriousness of the consequences of poor torpedo quality that has led me to dwell on this subject in such detail.